Oh, hey, we're on the air. How you doing? Sorry, I was a little bit out of it. Welcome to Trinity Talk Live, water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective. I'm Ken Coughlin.
And I'm Ben Lander.
And thank you very much for joining us today. For those of you that are surprised to see us, I messed up. Last week, well, I'll get to that in a minute because I think the order of the slides, I'll mess up my daughter if I do that. She'll get mad at me. So why don't we first start by saying, hey, if you haven't, it's the first time watching the show, let me tell you a little bit about what we're all about. The tagline says it all. We are water cooler conversation from a Christian perspective, which means essentially what we try to do here is we try to talk about whatever topics people are talking about around the water cooler, the same conversations you're seeing everywhere, but we try to bring a particularly Christian perspective to it. Does that mean that we speak for all of Christianity? No. We speak for us. Matter of fact, we'll put the disclaimer. The opinions you hear on this program are not necessarily those held by Trinity Lutheran Church in Joplin, Maryland. They're simply the opinions of the commentators on the show. Sorry. Anyway, but we do try to look at these issues from a Christian perspective because that's something that quite often is lacking out there. Along those lines, I also do want to invite you to participate in this program. We've got four topics we try to go over each show. Some are going to be, I think, some hot topics. They usually are. We got some on the agenda for today as well. And you can be part of the conversation by submitting your comment in the live chat or in the comment section. We are live on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel and the Trinity Joppa Facebook page, and I am monitoring both right here on my trusty computer, and I got a backup lovely producer, my wife back there, that will let me know if I'm missing anything. So if you do comment on Facebook or on YouTube, either I'll see it here or she'll let me know the comment is on there, and we will read it right here on the air, and Ben and I can answer any questions you may have, comments, criticisms, agree with us, disagree with us, whatever. You can be part of the program, so please do so. We welcome it. The other thing I want to mention, what I started off the top of the show saying that I messed up, last week we announced that Trinity Talk Live was moving. As you can tell, we are live now on Monday at noon, where we've been for a little while here. A few months this has been our time slot, but we are moving to Wednesdays at 5:30. That was supposed to, we'd announced last week, that was going to happen this week. I should look at my calendar before I make announcements. Have another commitment this Wednesday night. Not only do I have another commitment this Wednesday night, it's Wednesday night at 6 is my commitment, but that commitment is right here in the sanctuary using all of the same video equipment.
This space has a commitment.
Yeah, everything here except Ben has a commitment Wednesday night at 6. Well, no, the table doesn't.
The
We're not
live
using the table.
stream has a commitment.
The live stream has a commitment. It's not a public video, so if you're looking for it, tough. But we do have something at the stream this Wednesday night. And so we could not move Trinity Talk Live to Wednesdays this week. That is still happening. However, we are going to be Wednesday at 5:30 starting next week. So please make sure you join us then. So with all that being said, I think we've gotten through the preliminaries. We've got some fun issues today. I'm betting this is going to be one of our longer programs. We'll find out. So Ben, why don't you start us off with our first topic?
Sure thing. All right, so our first story today is, there's a number of different, kind of like a lot of these, there's a number of different articles that we could have pulled from. Actually, I think I sent Ken several, but I only have one pulled up here. I'll kind of reference it. But it refers to, I'm sure many of you who are watching have at least heard of, the peace deal that was brokered this past week, August 12th to be exact, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, and that was facilitated through President Trump and his Director of Foreign Affairs, Jared Kushner. And basically what this peace deal is, it's been a long time coming of talks of peace in the Middle East. And I remember hearing, it's almost kind of a joke that people talk about it being peace in the Middle East, almost as if it is unattainable. But what has happened this past week is that it seems to be a little bit more attainable. Not that it by any means is a peace deal for all of the Middle East, but what has happened is the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the is it a Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates? That's also a Prime Minister. Have gotten together on a three-way phone call with President Trump and have agreed to a peace treaty. Now, what's different about this peace treaty? It's the third time that Israel has been recognized by an Arab state. That the first time was in 1979, I believe, by Egypt, and then again in 1994 by Jordan, and then now by the United Arab Emirates this year in 2020. And the difference between this one, though, is that the other two have been predicated upon a agreement from Israel to stop, basically land for peace is what the tagline has been, land for peace. They'll give up land and then for an assurance of peace with those nations. The difference between this deal is that the tagline is reading peace for peace. So there's no secession of land. It's just a agreement to end hostilities for a time. And Israel has agreed to postpone, or some are reading it as suspend,
right.
Suspend annexation of the West Bank of Israel in Palestinian occupied territory. Well, it's disputed territory, long-time disputed territory. So there's a lot that we continue to go into with this. There's a lot of minutiae. That's almost a new word that I created. A lot of minutiae and details of this that I encourage you to read about. But that's kind of the long and short of it. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm going to throw you for a loop right off the bat, because my initial take, and we'll get into the details of the treaty, but the initial take I'm going to throw out there is probably not one that you even thought we were going to go into with this story, but it is related to what you said at the very beginning, that you sent me multiple stories to read about this. And this is admittedly a side note, but I got to mention it. I'm not going to, again, I don't want to get overly political, so I'm not going to mention which media outlets the stories were from, but you sent me 3 different stories.
I tried to be unbiased. There were ones
Well, here's the thing, and that's what I found interesting here, okay? Of the 3 stories that I read, all right, one from one media outlet was very much, look at this great deal that the president just negotiated, and look at all these other things the president has done in the past that actually set the stage to make this deal possible, whether it be getting out of the treaty with Iran, whether it be moving the consulate to Jerusalem instead of Tel Aviv. All of those things are mentioned in this article. It's basically saying all of these steps the president has taken in the past made it possible for him to do this deal, which nobody else has been able to get done in the past. All right. So that was the tone of one of the reporting articles on this. Another one, if you want to say the next step down, was look at this deal. This is something that's, been hard pressed, and it's a really good accomplishment. But, maybe the Trump administration is going a little too far with some of the jargon and some of the rhetoric they're throwing out there about it, all right? Then there was a third article that was like, this is completely meaningless. There's this deal that he struck, but this is not anywhere near the amount of peace that President Trump promised that he was going to deliver. And it was like, wow. And you wonder why people don't trust the media. It's just 3 different stories, 3 different tones, and all clearly trying to do more than just, and the one in the middle was probably the best. Like I said, there was one that I felt was more middle of the road, but clearly trying to not just report what happened in the deal, but influence your opinion about it. Yeah. And I was like, wow. And none of these were listed as opinion pieces, mind you, or letters to the editor. So that's the first thing I want to say there. Just, buyer beware when it comes to your media and how you consume it. So thank you for sending multiple stories about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost kind of like reminds me of that classic example of a car crash. If you get witnesses to a car crash, they're at different angles. They're going to come at it from a different perspective and different angles. And it's clearly, if you look up multiple articles, depending on your news source, you can see that very clearly with this deal.
So I guess getting to the deal itself, all right, I guess what we should do here as our lead-off story, because there's a lot of different approaches we could take to this, I do want to talk about it from a political perspective, and I don't mean politics like Republican versus Democrat. I just mean the world politics sphere, what this means for that. And then we got to tackle it from a theological perspective, because there's people out there that are wondering about that, so we'll get into that too. But I'm going to start with just the political aspects of it. This is, in my mind, despite the tone of the various different 3 articles that I read, this is pretty awesome. Now, it's not overly awesome. We need to be cautious. The specific deal was that Israel and the United Arab Emirates have this peace deal that is going to include things such as opening embassies, trade, technology, and direct flights and tourism.
That was a big one.
That was a really
big takeaway.
one.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, so that's kind of, and what Israel, like you pointed out, the tone in the past has always been, people wanted Israel to give up land in exchange for peace. Whereas all they did here is they were, Benjamin Netanyahu was talking about annexing certain portions of the West Bank and actively pursuing that. And what he said is, I'm going to suspend that for now. Now, he's been very clear. He's not saying he's giving it up entirely.
Right. In fact, I think he's even said he's not given up on sovereignty. That's still a goal, sovereignty, which still is the complete annexation of the West Bank.
Right. And well, but here, taking that sovereignty thing, and here's what I think is probably the most profound about this deal, is what you said before. It's only the third time that in history, since the reformation of Israel, that it's been recognized by one of the 22 Arab nations as a sovereign entity. Now, forget the borders and the disputed land for a moment. Let's just talk about the existence of a nation of Israel. For most of the Arab nations in that part of the world, the approach has been they don't even recognize that this nation exists as an entity that can be negotiated with, that you can strike deals with. And so that is a huge step, regardless of what you think of the deal itself and how long it's going to last or anything like that. The fact that they entered into an agreement with Israel, thereby recognizing a nation of Israel, is huge in my mind. And the rumor is, while nobody's talking about any details or specifics, they're all playing it close to the vest. The rumor is this the first of others to come?
And there certainly seems to be, depending on which article you read, there certainly seems to be others that are close to that. Like even I think it was Bahrain had praised the UAE for their step forward. So it seems like Bahrain would presumably be not far behind. And a few others as well.
Now, speaking of people that aren't in favor of it, let's talk about the Palestinians. All right. Obviously, one takeaway from this has been that has maybe the United Arab Emirates devaluing, I guess, the whole Palestinian movement, plight, whatever you want to call it, their quest to be recognized as their own sovereignty and their own nation. Because of course the Palestinians are very much at odds with Israel, and they want to have the two-state solution, so to speak. And this I found puzzling. I'm curious about your thoughts on this, because the Palestinian authorities basically have blasted the United Arab Emirates. I think one of the articles mentioned they're pulling their embassy. They have an embassy in the UAE that they're pulling out as a result of this, and yet the number one reason that I saw in here that the UAE was giving for entering this deal is because they were afraid that if Israel went forward with its annexation of the land in the West Bank, that was going to be a death blow for any potential two-state solution negotiations.
Yeah, a lot of articles described as a ticking time bomb, right? So they were kind of unscrewing that fuse to the time bomb,
which would seem to be helping the Palestinians in the sense that they're, so they're saying, look, okay, we recognize the nation of Israel, but we got them to stop, at least temporarily, the annexation of the West Bank territory, which would have meant there's no chance of reaching a two-state solution. And so it almost seems like the UAE could kind of come back and say, wait a minute, what we were doing here was actually helpful to you.
Yeah, they could make that argument, and it's reasonable, it's logical. I think more so what the Palestinians see it as a betrayal of their sovereignty, right? So they're recognizing Israel's sovereignty, but not Palestine's sovereignty. And so even I think one of the leaders of Palestine had kind of commented and said, may you never be betrayed by your quote-unquote friends. Speaking of the UAE.
Well, and I think part of the problem, and this, again, I'm just reading this is from, I guess, the UAE's perspective, according to some of the articles that we read here. Part of the problem is that the Palestinian authorities can't get their own act together, in the sense that you've got one ruling family in the West Bank and one in Gaza, and they're at odds amongst themselves. And so it's kind of like, okay, you want us to recognize you, well, then get your own stuff sorted out so we know who we're even talking to, And
that seems to almost be part of what facilitated this, that the political disunity in Palestine has kind of led other surrounding Arab nations to kind of question their support of Palestine. And really what this deal has tried to do, I think, has shifted discussion away from historical disputes into what's their common enemy, right? Which seems to be Iran right now at the moment.
Right, and that article that I was talking about, that was kind of outlining the well, shall we say, the more pro-administration article that was saying, well, here's all the things that they've done in the past, the administration's done in the past that set the stage for this and made this possible. That was one of the things that it mentioned. I guess must have been, I don't know, it was an interview or just comments that Jared Kushner gave, where he basically was saying, look, the perspective that this administration took, the approach that this administration took was different. Rather than focusing on those things that the two parties are disagreeing about, they essentially united them around a common enemy.
Yeah.
They said, hey, you guys may disagree about X, Y, and Z, but both of you have issues with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
No, are we pronouncing? Or no,
I'm sorry, Iran.
Iran. Yes, I'm sorry. We got taken to task for that in a
Yeah.
prior episode about mispronouncing that. But both of them have issues with Iran. So let's unite around that and realize, that's essentially what they're talking about. One approach is you're creating I hate to say it this way, but an anti-Iran bloc in amongst those Arab nations, and then you can start to see how some here in the United States would say the creation of such a bloc is in the United States' interests.
Sure.
Because we obviously have issues with Iran as well. And so if you're wondering, well, what is the United States' role? Why do we even care about what's going on in the Middle East? Well, here's why.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of, I think, the meat of it right there is why the U.S. would be interested in this deal.
So let me ask you, I call it a bridging question. All right, so we've done the hard politics thing, which we're not a hard politics show, so we'll move on past that. But now this is the bridging to the deeper theological question. So it's kind of related, keeping a foot in both spheres for a minute. We often hear, and there's differences of opinions within the Christian church about, supporting Israel, not supporting Israel. Let's take that for a moment, because I do believe that we should be supportive of Israel. How far does that go? What does that mean to support Israel? And specifically, if you were to look at the historical borders of the nation of Israel as was originally granted by God, there's Palestinians within those borders.
Right.
So, as a Christian, I want to phrase this the right way. How about we just say this? Let's talk about the two-state solution options from a Christian perspective.
Okay.
Well, what does it mean to support Israel, and how far does that go? Does supporting Israel mean that you have to reject Palestine as its own separate nation?
No, I don't think it means that we need to reject Palestine wholesale. I think there is a large dispute around specifically that West Bank territory that you're right, that's occupied by Palestinians, that historically speaking, given by God, is Israel's territory. It's the promised land that God had given them. So from a Christian perspective, we share a common spiritual history with Israel, with the Hebrew nation. And so I think our support should lean towards them having their own sovereign land that God has given to them. Without getting too political about the whole two-state solution there, I think I would tend to lean toward more so support of Israel's occupation rather than Palestine's. But I don't know.
Does that mean we kick the Palestinians out? I mean, is that the solution? Because, okay, I mean, here's what you'd...
So...
Go ahead, sorry.
No, well, and so look at that. Do we kick the Palestinians out, or do we draw the border, still allowing Palestinians to live in their understanding? There's in Scripture specific laws given to the Hebrews about welcoming foreigners and how they should treat foreigners among them. So even historically speaking, even back in Abraham, even back in post Mosaic time, when the generations entered into the promised land, there's still rules there about how they should welcome foreigners and treat foreigners. So it's kind of an expectation that hospitality is really part of their the faith and part of how they should treat people. So what's the hospitable thing to do from a Christian perspective? Do we kick them out, or do we work with them?
I love you just asking questions and not answering. You'd make a good politician.
I'm trying to think through it myself, honestly.
So that's okay. I guess here's, for whatever it's worth, my thoughts on the matter. God certainly did outline certain boundaries for the nation of Israel. We see God's hand throughout history. God, even after God gave the land of Israel to them, he did also send them to exile, in different phases, and brought certain of them back,
Right.
and they rebuilt Jerusalem. Well, we're going to get to that in a minute. But
That's a good bridge.
So even under God's watch, if you want to call it that, under the Old Testament times, all right, the boundaries of the nation of Israel were not always consistent, and they were not the primary focus.
Sure.
I mean, the primary focus of the Old Testament was that relationship with God and Israel, sending all the prophets about, Israel being like the unfaithful wife or whatever, thing like
Yep.
that, and wanting to bring them back to God. So I think maybe we talk a little bit about too much about boundaries per se, and not relationship and other things. So when we're talking about the whether or not the Palestinians should have their own state, and I don't think the solution is kick them out of the territory. I think there's got to be some middle ground in there, and I don't think we need to get so caught up in the specific territory as much as we do the relationship. In an ideal situation, they could all live in the same land and be hospitable to each other and get along and all that, as long as the Jews are free to worship,
Right.
Freely. So anyway, I don't know. Are you trying to signal me that you've made a comment online? 'Cause I'm not seeing it if you have. I'm sorry, say it again?
You can repeat this back to me, to them if they can't hear me.
Okay.
I have a comment to make. I would say it's.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Zach Kreiner is actually here, and he's one of our tech folks, and he's actually here today, and so he's going to tell me his question, and I'll repeat it on air.
Well, I would say that it's almost a multi-part question, because like when you talk about like, you ask the question like, do we kick them out? Well, there's a difference between kicking out a political idea, or kicking out a moral idea, or kicking out people physically, right? It's a multi-part question. It's like, what do you want to welcome and what do you not want to welcome? As far as ideas, as far as people, and I'd say as Christians, we want to welcome people always and focus more on what ideas do we want and not want.
So the gist of it, and I'll try to get this right, what Zach was saying is that he thinks that it's almost a multi-part question, that there's a difference between welcoming people and welcoming ideas, whether it be political ideas or moral ideas. And so the examination really should be one of, yes, we want to welcome people, but are there certain ideas that we don't want to welcome? We don't want to be welcoming, whether it be moral ideas or political ideas. And here's where I'll say I agree with you in that we certainly want to welcome people, and that's why I say I think the conversation about the borders, I know we talk about them from a political perspective, it's a little too. We get caught up in that a little bit too much. I don't think necessarily to be a nation of Israel, it needs to have all the exact same boundaries it did originally, because we didn't, throughout history, it hasn't had those boundaries. When you're talking about being welcoming of ideas, then we get back to something you and I have talked about a lot on the show before, is that, me, I am a big believer in the open marketplace of ideas. I want people to be able to express them freely. That being said, we also need to be free to say, hey, you're wrong. I think you're wrong, and here's why. And then let the marketplace talk about those ideas. So and now, are there exceptions to that? Sure, if somebody wants to come in and talk about the merits of, mass genocide, I'm going to say, you know what? We're going to draw the line here somewhere. Right. And so, and I know that's a difficult problem, but any freedoms, there's limitations on all freedoms, and that's just a fact of life, and it's a necessity of life. But yeah, I think there is a difference between welcoming people, and if by welcoming ideas you mean what we see in the culture today, just affirming everything's fine, everything's right, then that's a problem, and we don't want to be doing that.
Well, and if you look biblically and historically, God had set boundaries for his people. He said, you are to be holy and to be set apart. And part of what he did with the rules that he gave in the Levitical Code is to keep the Israelites from being polluted by the world, as it were, to keep them from adopting the customs of the surrounding nations. And we see every time that they did that, things went poorly for Israel, and they were punished. They were subject, and God raised up judges to bring them back. And then until you get to the end of Judges, and you see just this completely depraved state of Israel, and the people did what was right in their own eyes, Scripture says. And so there's a reason that God tells them to be holy, to be set apart. So I think, Zach, to your question, or to your point, to your comment, that's a good point, that there's a difference between welcoming people and welcoming ideas, and that hospitality, biblically speaking, is supposed to be practiced, is encouraged for the Israelites to practice. It's part of their faith in action. So hospitality and welcoming foreigners is important, but at the same time, they should keep themselves from adopting those same customs. Every time, when we look at Judges, they went back to Baal worship, or whatever the offense was to God, and God handed them over. He handed them over into their sin. And so we see that. And so as Christians, I think, we should support the nation of Israel. I think you make a good point, Ken, about that not necessarily needing to be the exact boundaries as it's historically been, because you're right, they've been spread out. There's the diaspora. They're spread out across the earth. But that was the importance of them regaining nationhood.
Right, exactly.
They could be centralized again and be brought back. And of course, we get into the significance of that for the nation itself, and the building of a temple and a centralized.
You're trying to set up the transition, aren't you?
I am.
So let's go with that transition. So we've talked about it from a purely world politics perspective. We've had my little bridging question that had some political and possible theological ramifications to it. Let's go full-fledged theology, crack open the Bible. Ben, this clearly is the beginning of the Great Tribulation, isn't it? All right, for those of you that don't know, I mean, there's differences of opinion. Daniel obviously made a number of prophecies. One of the most famous ones is the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Mm-hmm. And there was this period of 69 weeks, and then or 69 sevens, I should say, right. Groups of seven, and then a 70th seven, or a 70th week. And there's multiple interpretations of what this prophecy means. Some people think it's all been fulfilled in the past. Others think something differently. And without going into too much detail, one view of this prophecy is that the initial 69 weeks, each week refers to a period of 7 years, mm-hmm. and that the first 69-week period began with the instruction or the permission issued to Nehemiah to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, and that was approximately 444 BC. And then if you do the math from that, essentially what they're saying is that 69-week period, that 69 periods of 7 years apiece, right. ended with Jesus' crucifixion. Yep. And so because if you look after the 69th week, Daniel talks about the anointed one being cut off. And yep. so that's a reference to the crucifixion. And then there's a gap, and then there's another period of 7 weeks or 7 years.
Yeah.
Okay? And so that is supposed to be the Great Tribulation, after which Jesus is going to return, and that period of 7 years is supposed to commence when, according to one interpretation, this person who may or may not, be recognized as such yet, but the Antichrist, mm-hmm. is going to strike a deal, a peace treaty with Israel. Okay? Right. And so that's where the conversation now starts in theological circles. We just saw a peace treaty struck with Israel, one that, let's be honest, despite the viewpoint of one article that we read, is pretty profound, that I don't think a lot of people saw coming.
Yeah.
All right? So, is this the beginning of the Great Tribulation? You see, I set it up so you could be the first to answer. Go, Ben.
I would be hesitant to say that it is. I don't think that it's the peace treaty that is spoken of in Daniel chapter 9. And you did a great job kind of explaining the 70 weeks and the prevailing thought there, like a 7, so there's 77s, kind of like how we view a gap of like 10 years being a decade. So a 7 is like a 7-year time period. And so when we look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 really is where it is. And he shall, this is the ruler at that time, Antichrist, shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, or 1 7-year period, one eschatological week. And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So yeah, if you look at Daniel, this is really apocalyptic in nature, or well, apocalypse just means revelation, but a revealing. But it's really eschatological in nature, talking about the day of the Lord, and so that's really, we are talking about end times here. And Jesus actually references it in Matthew when he's pressed and he's asked about the day of the Lord, the day of his return. So yeah, you could make the agreement, but the reason I'm hesitant to say that it is the beginning of that 7-year tribulation is there's no real mention here of a time period for the peace, right? So there's a clear reference here to it has to be for 7 years. This may be a precursor to it. I'm not going to rule that out. I think we definitely can read the signs of the times and see what is happening. There's definitely been a increased interest in peace deals in the Middle East, specifically with Israel. Another thing is this isn't the first time that a peace treaty has been brokered with Israel. You know, we saw it in 1979, we saw it in 1994. So again, that's another reason that I would be hesitant to say that this is the peace deal that's brokered. But I think it's leading up to that would be my take.
Yeah, and I'll say the number one reason why I say I'd be hesitant to say this is definitely the peace deal or anything like that is because Jesus himself said no one knows when he's going to return. Yes, Zach has another comment.
Another reason to be hesitant is if you're looking at it as a specific single Antichrist figure, the question with UAE would be, well, who actually is that?
Yeah, and that's what I was going to bring up next. What Zach is, the point he's raising is another reason to be hesitant if you're looking at this specifically as being with the UAE, then who is the Antichrist in this whole exchange? Because a couple other things, according to this interpretation, for example, is the Antichrist is going to essentially declare himself worthy of being worshipped, to reject all other world religions and say, you know, I am the God that you need to worship. Does that really strike you as something that any Islamic leader would be able to get away with?
Right.
You know, and if those of you that are at all conversant with the Islamic religion, the answer to that is no.
No.
Absolutely not.
Categorically no.
Categorically no. And so that's kind of it. That tends to mean that, well, then if that interpretation of Scripture is correct and that's actually what the Antichrist is going to do, then this doesn't really seem to fit. At least he's not going to be the Antichrist. Who else is going to be the Antichrist? You're going to try to say that President Trump is the Antichrist for his role in this deal?
Or Netanyahu, or even there's some that say Jared Kushner.
Well, you know, in President Trump's case, he's not the one that actually struck the deal. He
Right.
was just a broker. And so you inevitably end up with all, because believe me, I've seen plenty of memes on Facebook saying that President Trump is the Antichrist. Okay. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit if this is your interpretation. Now, again, I want to say, so we're clear, we are kind of framing this all in this one interpretation of Daniel's vision. There are other biblical scholars who disagree with all of this,
Right,
who will
and
say
say
that
it's
this is
already
all
been-
fulfilled in the past. But, you know, because of, obviously, this is a very popular one. The Left Behind series several years ago, you know, made it popular as well. That's why we're kind of approaching it just from, you know, within this perspective.
And another reason to be hesitant is that clearly if you look after verse 27 here, it talks about putting an end to sacrifice and offering. Well, in order to put an end to sacrifice and offering halfway through that 7-year period, so 3.5 years in, that's where you get your mid-tribulation folks for the whole rapture, and that's a whole other sidebar that we can go down. But in order for there to be an end to sacrifices, there have to be sacrifices in the first place. And there are talks right now, and they actually have, depending on what you believe and what you've looked into, Israel has been talking about building a third temple, but as of the brokering of this particular deal, it's not been built yet. There is no third temple built yet, and no sacrifices. There is a Sanhedrin that is active currently, but to my knowledge, they're not. They haven't reinstituted sacrifices. Now, if somebody out there can prove me wrong, please do so.
No, but it's interesting. I was reading and getting ready for today, I was reading an interpretation that said that, at least according to this interpretation, it doesn't necessarily need to literally mean an end to the sacrificial system as much as an end to Jewish worship. In other words, that the Antichrist will come in and basically prohibit the Jews from worshiping, basically worshiping Yahweh, and instead saying no, worship the Antichrist. And so that now I don't know if I agree with that, because you're right. It does seem to be pretty specific in that regard. But that's one idea that's out there. Is one person saying you don't really have to have the sacrificial system in place, because it doesn't necessarily need to be referring specifically to that. It's just talking about, that's kind of a colloquial way of referring to the religion of the Jewish, their Jewish practices at the time that people, when it was written, would understand. And so it's just referring to that. But interesting. What I find kind of one of the most interesting points that you made here earlier, Ben, and I agree with you on, is let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this interpretation of Daniel's prophecy is correct, that we are coming into another period at some point in the future of 7 years, all right, of tribulation, that is going to be commenced with a peace treaty. What I find more interesting about this article than this particular deal itself is the rumors that this could be the start of more. That it seems to be, it's not just that there's this one individual deal struck, there seems to be almost an atmosphere in that region of the country right now that this is now an acceptable thing to do. Whereas even just a few years ago, it certainly was not. I'd say even last week, I wouldn't have thought this would have happened, okay? And so the question then becomes, is this ushering an era of more treaties, and could one of those be the treaty? I don't know. Jesus said, I don't know when nobody knows when he's going to return, so I'm going to take him at his word for that,
Right.
But it's interesting.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so, and I agree with you on that. There's, just like, Jesus himself said, no one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son, but only the Father. So, clearly we can't say precisely this is when the August 12th, 2020, that's, boom, the start of the 7-year tribulation. No, nobody knows the exact day or hour. But like you're saying, there's rumors of more, and so it's cultivating this this paradigm shift, if we can be so bold as to say that, in the Middle East, where at one time peace was thought unattainable, and now they're starting to say, oh well, yeah, maybe Bahrain will be next, maybe this other nation will be next, and there's going to be peace and safety. And so that brings us to another scripture to look at. Not that we know the exact day, but we should be able to discern the seasons and the times and knowing. And so 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 kind of points us to that. It says, now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. So there, right there, unexpectedly, right? We shouldn't know when it is, but we should be prepared. That's not to say we shouldn't be prepared. And here it is, verse 3. While people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. So again, it's this sudden, like a thief in the night thing. So again, we're not going to know the day or the hour, but when you start hearing peace and prosperity, our ears should perk up. And we should always be ready for Christ's return, but even more so as we hear those things.
Well, and that's the takeaway, I guess, to wrap up this article. I mean, we knew, like I said at the beginning, this was going to be a long episode. We knew we were going to be talking about this because there's so many angles to talk about the story from. I really wanted to hit on them. But I think that's the takeaway we as Christians, you want to know a Christian perspective on it? Live every day as if Jesus is going to come back that day.
Amen.
And then you're not, all this stuff is, so all this is interesting, but to me, and some people, I know there's some people out there that they just live by this stuff and trying to predict all this, that, and the other. That's not for me, because my motto is live as if every day Jesus can come back that day, and then all of this stuff about predicting the future and everything, it's interesting, but it does become secondary.
Yeah.
My primary focus is trying to make sure that my relationship with Jesus today is what it should be.
Amen.
So, all right, hey, that was fun. Let's move on.
45 minutes later.
Yeah, I know, but we knew that was going to happen.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next story. What's our next story, Ben?
All right. Oh, yeah, we're switching it up. So our next story.
Yeah, we do have more stories to talk about today, man.
This one's an interesting phenomenon. So again, this was another one that there were several articles and actually a YouTube video. That's what kind of sparked my interest. Apparently, this has been going on since, in the U.S. at least, since 2013. But there's this phenomenon out there called atheist church, or at least that's the turn of phrase that's being coined here, is atheist church. The actual term that they're using is Sunday assembly. So what's happening is there's this group of people, we'll call it a congregation, that are gathering of atheists that gather on Sunday mornings in various places in the UK and now even in America, where they hold services and it, for all intents and purposes, is like a church service, although they remove every reference to God. And it's interesting. And so they tend to replace that with nature or scientific. The sermons or homilies are all about scientific discovery. I'll just kind of just briefly read. It was launched. Who were the? Oh, instead of hymns, the non-faithful get to tap their feet and sing along to Stevie Wonder and Queen songs. So again, there's whatever reason they have in that. There's a reading from Alice in Wonderland.
Well, do you need a reason really to tap along to Stevie Wonder? I mean, I got
True.
So.
I guess a purpose for the whole thing. There's a reading from Alice in Wonderland and a PowerPoint presentation from a particle physicist, Dr. Harry Cliff, who explains the origins of antimatter theory. Here it is. Jones and co-founder Pippa Evans were kind of co-founders of at least this one that the BBC is talking about. But there are these pop-up congregations all over, and it seems to be gaining traction of just this phenomenon of atheists gathering together.
Okay, my only question is why?
We'll go into that. That's a good question. I have a theory on that.
Why?
Well,
Why?
I'll throw it to you again. Why? Why is this happening?
Because okay, here's why. And one of these articles actually hit on it. And don't let me forget, remind me, because there's also kind of a warning, I think, in all of this to Christians, which I don't want to forget to talk about. But in answer to that question, here's one of the articles. It says, the audience, overwhelmingly young, white, and middle class, appear excited to be part of something new and speak of the void they felt on a Sunday morning when they decided to abandon their Christian faith.
Yeah.
That's why.
I caught that too. Yeah.
Okay? That's why. Because...
Okay, my question stands. Why?
Because, and this is going to C.S. Lewis talked about this a bit, that God has designed us in such a way that there is a void in us that only He can fill. And this is what you see, so much sin can be explained this way too, is attempts to fill that void with something other than Him are inevitably going to fail. And what you're seeing here is these people are recognizing that, but still trying to fill it by focusing on the what can be called the accidents of worship, and meaning the superficial, the surface elements of worship. They're thinking, okay, when I was in church, there was something I was getting out of that that I feel like I'm missing now. So let me try to replace that by doing all the surface stuff. And of course,
So we have to have songs. So we have to have somebody speaking. So we have to have
It literally hits all the
a
same
reading
beats.
from some piece of literature.
Zach, come here. Come here. No, finish talking, Mary Kay. I just want him to come up here while
Okay.
you're finishing your thought.
Hold on, I gotta put it on.
Stand right. Get over right here. Get over here.
So that they're taking the elements of worship and they're filling it with some non-secular, whatever they can find.
No, it's all secular.
Secular.
Right.
They're filling it with some kind of
A secular alternative.
Facsimile,
yeah.
Yeah, facsimile thereof. World, Zach, world. I just, rather than me repeating you here, talking to the mic.
So, I think an interesting.
You have to read it.
We do have another comment from YouTube as well.
Jeanette Harrington says, "Me too. Why?" Do you know when she posted that?
When I said why. I don't,
Oh, the why question. Well, that's my theory, Jeanette. Here,
Yeah.
go ahead.
and then you have another.
I have a
one.
YouTube.
Yep.
Oh, hello from Israel. Hello, Raphael
hello.
Green.
Hi.
Well, I'm curious, Raphael, if you just tuned in now, or if you were able to watch the first story where we were talking about Israel, because if you were, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on the peace treaty between Israel. I don't know if it's technically a treaty, but the peace deal between Israel and UAE.
Yeah.
If you have any thoughts to share about that, I'd be really interested in hearing them. If you could put them in the comments section, we'd like to share them here on the air. Anyway, go ahead, Zach.
So, I think I can give some interesting perspective to this as a young person who has friends and people that I regularly interact with who are either of another religion or consider themselves to be agnostic or atheist. And, you hear a lot, particularly from younger generations, when they talk about people who are religious, they tend to have this line of thinking that religion is something that people grasp onto as a means to like feel good about life or feel happy about life, or like to give life a meaning that they see as like artificial. And I think for them, like doing this could be their way of providing that for themselves, but with something that they can physically grasp onto and see, because they can see nature and the world around them. So for them, they might see that as, well, I'm doing the same thing as this Christian or this Muslim or whatever is doing, but I'm doing it with things that I can see around me, right? So that's better, right? Because it's not, it's they see God as this like idea, and not that Christians hold on to, and not an actual being like we see him.
And that's the undercurrent that I see with all of this, is that they remove every mention of God in favor of a secular humanist view. So everything is kind of humanist, only what we can see. And I think he even explains in one of the articles that no sermon shall espouse anything that is supernatural. No, that was actually on their website. I'm sorry, I clicked on their website. And it says no sermon will basically will espouse anything, any supernatural thing. So it's a naturalism, it's a humanism kind of thing. And I think to your point, Ken, I agree with you. This is why it's happening, because I think it was C.S. Lewis who talks about the altar of the human heart. Every human heart has an altar on it. You're going to worship something. And that's the takeaway from this, that even atheists who claim no belief in any deity whatsoever still are worshiping something. And when you remove every mention of God, all that's left is ourselves, right? And we've set ourselves up as God.
Well, and getting to your point, Zach, about the the idea that permeates a lot of the atheistic culture. And you always impress me, Zach, because you're a gamer, and I know you are in a community that let's just say the more conservative branches of Christianity are not overwhelmingly represented in that community, and so there is a notion that runs through we want to call it a straw man argument, a red herring that you hear in a lot of atheist circles, that Christians just believe, people who believe in God, it's their crutch. It's the crutch idea. You just need a crutch, and so you rely upon God as a crutch. Not only is that just false, that's one of the things I do as an apologist. Is no, you know why I believe in God? Because, well, first of all, I have a relationship with him, obviously, and it's kind of like trying to somebody deny me that Ben exists while I'm sitting here talking to him. But ultimately, the evidence also supports it. I'm a lawyer who examines evidence, and that's how I came to this. That the evidence is there. It's not because I was a crutch. As a matter of fact, like C.S. Lewis talks about as well. It's just such an absurd notion, because by our nature, what we would say our fallen nature, there's so many things we would love to go out and do. But for the fact that God says no. Now, that doesn't mean that God's a big giant party pooper. That's a whole other conversation to have. But the human nature is such that there's all these things we want to do. So if God is not a crutch in that regard, yes, there are sacrifices you make in your life as a result of accepting Jesus Christ.
But when God says no, understanding, that's always for a greater yes.
Right.
Right. So he has these parameters in place, because left to our own devices, we go outside of those parameters, and it's disastrous. And we see that when we descend into anarchy and all of these other things.
These are very cardigan. I can't hear you until
I know. That's actually a possible segue into something I was about to say, which is a very interesting side of this, which you could probably spend a whole nother episode on. You're welcome, Ken.
It's probably going to end up being 2 episodes.
So there's also this sense, particularly amongst younger people nowadays, of like they still have this want to be morally right. But it leads to this topic of, well, how do you arrive at morals without a God, without a greater being? What gives you your morals? But it's, I think, they might be drawn to stuff like this because they see it as, well, we know that there are things that are morally wrong, like You shouldn't worship money and blah, well, now we're in the whole age of like, being rich is evil and stuff like that. Another topic. But, I think they see this as, well, we're worshiping nature and the stuff around us, and they see that as morally better than like worshiping money or objects or things, stuff.
So, Lori Hinman on Facebook says, I'm completely fine with someone saying that God is just a crutch. A crutch is a help in times of need. Yes, I need God. And I agree with you in that regard. I guess my one dispute would be, I don't know if I would describe God as just a crutch, because God is more than that. Is God someone you can rely upon in your times of need? Absolutely.
The thing is, he's a crutch, but you always have a broken leg.
Yeah, he's a crutch, but you always have a broken leg.
He's more than a crutch. He's my life support system.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
but here's the thing.
without it.
Here's what we need to
with
be
you.
careful of, I think, as Christians, is we need to be careful not to create the impression that we only believe in God because of what he can do for us. Because he's a crutch for me, that's why I believe he...
Or there's some kind of mental breakdown or ineptitude in our thinking that we have to rely on
Right.
God. Yeah.
Because that's how the atheist, the common atheist refrain comes up. It's like, you guys, there's actually no evidence for any of this. You're believing in spite of all the evidence being against you because of this felt need you have, and that's really the only basis you have for it. That is a false statement. That's, maybe I should have explained myself more clearly. That's what I think we need to combat. And she says, I don't say just, and this is Lori Hinman again, following up, says, I don't say just. Most people who bring up that argument say that. Thank you, Lori. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And that's what I was just getting at a second ago. Now I do want to hit on something else that you just hit on, Zach, and I saw you nodding along with it because you didn't even read these articles. But let's talk a little bit about some of the topics that are discussed. I got to find them here. Where was the article? There was an article in here that talks about some of the topics they bring up, and a lot of them are moral topics that they're talking about. Here, would it ever be right to punch a Nazi was one of the topics of conversation that come up. The discussion was led by a husband and wife team who pointed out that hurting people was usually a bad idea, but that it might sometimes be the only way to protect the innocent. And the same thing, it's like Sunday's Assembly own mantra. Here's the mantra for the Sunday Assembly, this group. Here it is. Yeah, I know. Live better, help often, wonder more. And I want to turn to these atheists and say, okay, live better, help often. I agree with you. Why? On your worldview, why should we help other people?
Well,
If this is all that matters, if you got one life and there's nothing after, then shouldn't you just do whatever you want? And why does it matter if I help people?
I was trying to hit on before, right? Is like, if there is no God, nothing greater than us, then don't we just create our own morals?
Yeah, and let me give, because we do have to move on to our next story here because it's already almost 1 o'clock, but let me give the example that I know you guys have probably both heard me give before. For those of you that I think we're getting a little too philosophical, let me try to bring it down to earth and simplify it with a way of thinking about it. Let's pretend that Zach here, because I feel like punching Zach today. Why am I looking? Your point.
Oh.
I'm on my close-up here. Let's pretend that. Oh, that's right. You moved. We can see Zach on my close-up now. I just assumed that I was on here, but you're okay. So
He's within striking range.
You keep talking up here.
let's pretend that Zach is walking down the street, okay, and he's whistling. Can you whistle? There you go. Zach is whistling on the street, and he crosses this bridge, and at the far side of the bridge, there's an alleyway, and I jump out of the alleyway, and I go, BAM! And I see Jeanette Harrington. I do see your comment. We'll get to it in just a second. I punch Zach out of the blue across the jaw. Zach, of course, is completely leveled because, but then Zach says, "Ow." And then what do you think he says? He says, that was wrong, I'm going to sue you. Because that's what everybody does nowadays, right? He says, I'm going to sue you for everything you're worth. At first I tell him, Zach, I work for a church now. I don't have anything. I'm not worth anything. But no, he says, I'm going to sue you for everything you're worth because I think you were legally wrong. I think the law of our land, the law of the state of Maryland, says that you were not allowed to do that, and as a result, now I get to sue you. And I turn to Zach and I say, well, your Google search does not substitute for my law degree. I love throwing that one out there. And I said, no, it's not illegal. It is perfectly legal for me to have punched you anytime I want. And Zach says, no, it's illegal. I said, no, it's legal. No, it's illegal. No, it's legal. No, and we go back and forth, back and forth. The question is that all there is? He has one opinion about what's legally right. I have another opinion about what's legally right. Is there ever any way we're ever going to resolve our disagreement? Well, sure there is, because we can consult the law book. We can open up the statutes of the state of Maryland and see what they say. And newsflash, they're going to say I was wrong. I can't just punch him willy-nilly, despite what he's done sometimes to make me want. No, I'm kidding. So there is a source above both of our opinions, independent of our opinions, that says which one of us is actually right and which one is actually wrong. Change the analogy a little bit now to, instead of him saying that he thinks I was legally wrong, he says he thinks I was morally wrong. It's morally wrong for you to have punched me. I say, no, I think it's morally right. We go back and forth. Is there a similar standard independent of us, above us, that decides who is actually right and who is actually wrong on the moral question? We act like there is. These atheist discussions are acting like there is. But on atheism, there isn't.
One of the greatest arguments I've ever heard for this, which is like super, super simple, and God, I cannot remember his last name. Ken,
Copeland.
the owner of the Creation Museum.
Ken Ham.
Thank you. Was in a debate one time, and he asked the question. He was in a debate with a profound atheist, right? And he asked the question, well, if someone comes and steals your bike, is that wrong? He said, well, of course he shouldn't steal my bike. That's wrong, right? He said, do you know anyone who would say that he's right for stealing your bike? It was like, no, I don't think so. He said, well, what tells you that stealing your bike is or isn't wrong? Did you just decide that, right? Why does everyone agree that stealing is wrong? And that and he, the person he was debating basically had no answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you one person who thinks stealing the bike was right, the person who stole it.
But exactly, right? But we have laws that say that stealing is wrong. Why did we decide in our laws that stealing is wrong?
Well, and that gets into, and this is a whole other conversation about the law being written on all our hearts and everything like that. So
we brought that up before.
We brought that up before. I do want to make sure we get to Jeanette's comment here, and she's getting back to the whole crutch issue. She said, Jeanette Harrington says she agrees with Lori. God is always my crutch in times of need, and God gives all the strength I need in times of difficult trials. And absolutely, I think
I'd almost view God more as the doctor that gives you the crutch, but you still need the doctor when you're healthy.
Well, and there's certainly more to God than just being a crutch. And here's the thing, and if you look at even the Old Testament, let's just take the 10 plagues of Egypt, for example. God didn't say, believe in me because I can do things for you,
right,
because I can be there for you. Now, God did say, I'll be there for you,
right,
okay? And so in that sense, is he a crutch? Sure, if you want to say he's a crutch in the sense that he has promised to be there to support us in our times of needs, absolutely. But then let's look at how he dealt with Pharaoh. He still sent the plagues to say, and because of this, you will know that I am God.
Right.
And so he wasn't afraid to, and we see this even in the New Testament. Paul gives very many evidences to support that Jesus rose from the dead. And so we do see throughout the Bible instances of, yes, the evidence does overwhelmingly support that this is all true. That is not antithetical to God also being there in our times of need. Those are complementary things, not conflicting.
Right.
And many atheists, I think, act as if the mere fact that God is there to support us, and we recognize that God is there to support us, must be the only reason we believe in him, and the only possible justification there is,
right,
and that's just not true.
Which is, a fallacy to begin with.
Right. Okay, we need to move on to our third story. So you going
right,
to step
before
down?
you-
Okay, thank you, Zach, very much. You know what's funny? Before we went on the air, Zach jokingly asked me, so Ken, when are you putting me on Trinity Talk Live? Today.
Surprise.
So before you move on,
All right,
I just want to make sure you covered something.
sure.
You said that you wanted to.
I did, thank you. I apologize
yeah.
for that. I did. The one cautionary note I wanted to give, because remember we talked about at the very beginning of this topic, how what they're trying to do is to duplicate that,
Right.
to fill that void, to duplicate that feeling by the accidents of worship, by the surface elements of worship. And so I find in here a cautionary note for Christians to make sure we're not doing that. That our worship is not, the primary focus of our worship is not on the accidents. It's not on the surface elements. It's on the gospel underneath. Because if it's not, then all you're doing is creating an artificial feeling in people that will last as long as they're in that worship building. But once they leave, they're going to feel that void again. And so now they're not coming to church out of a sincere relationship with Jesus Christ, but they're coming to church just to try to create that same artificial feeling, just as these atheist churches are doing.
Right. That reminds me of one thing real quick. I think it was Pastor Paul, but I always go back to this, where he said in a sermon of his, he said, if the Holy Spirit were to up and leave this church, or were to up and leave your life, how many Christians would notice? And I think what we see here is all the trappings of religion without the Holy Spirit, without God, right? And so that's the cautionary tale, like you're saying, is if we're just using those as a crutch, like okay, we're talking about using God as a crutch, using religion as a crutch. If your entire relationship with God is based on feeling, then that's only surface level, right? And so that's the caution there, is not to get caught up.
Thank you, Mary Kay.
That.
I did want to make sure I got that in. I appreciate it. That's what a good producer does. You see that? So, all right, story number 3. So this one comes out of California, and District Attorney Dan, I believe it's Dow. It's D-O-W. I apologize for mispronouncing that. He's a district attorney of San Luis Obispo. Again, I apologize for mispronouncing that. Obispo County in Southern California. And he has declared that his county is a sanctuary county for churches to worship and sing freely without worry of fines or arrest. So, let me give you a little bit of backstory about us. We've talked in the show before about what's going on in California, in the sense that, they, due to COVID-19 concerns, they had a certain number of restrictions, and then they eased up on those restrictions, and then recently they've had to tighten up on those restrictions again. And one of those restrictions, like we talked about, was last week. You talked about John MacArthur, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Has had an impact on churches being able to gather in person for in-person worship. It's prohibiting them basically from doing that. And we weren't clear, and I didn't get to follow up afterwards, whether or not were allowed to do outdoor worship.
So there's been a development since, I believe, just this past week. I could have sent that to you as well. So a judge granted them, they won the case against California, where and I don't know if it's any connection to this district attorney granting a sanctuary zone, but as far as, I believe it's Grace Community Church, that Pastor John MacArthur pastors, as far as that, and I don't know if it's going to be taken higher, but as far as this legal decision was concerned, they are not prevented. They're not going to take further legal action against Grace Community Church.
Well, and that gets into, remember we talked about last week, my personal opinion is there's two different ways to look at the question. There's the legal, overstepping of government question, should the government be permitted to do this? And there's the other question of what should we do as Christians? And I still hold to my comments from last week that I still have a problem with Pastor MacArthur having worship in his facility with, nothing. They're not social distancing from what we can tell. They're not wearing masks. Even if you take the approach that, that we are commanded by God to gather and worship, there's still other steps you could have taken, and he didn't. And so that bothered me a bit. But that's last week's episode. If you don't remember that, go back and watch last week. I want to explain something from the perspective of an attorney about this story and what exactly is going on here. All right. Ever heard of a plea agreement? You've heard of a plea deal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Deals, sure.
Same basic authority, if you want to call that, okay? District attorneys have authority, or Commonwealth attorneys, what they're called in Virginia, rather. They have authority to some extent to basically decide what are we going to prosecute, what are we not going to prosecute. And it's basically they're deciding how to divide up their resources, how to assign their resources in the most efficient and the best way. This is something the district attorneys, the authority they have all over the country. Anybody, and to some extent police officers have this. Anybody who's ever gotten out of a speeding ticket, you're very happy for that authority because the fact of the matter is the police officer is given some amount of discretion to decide whether or not to write you that ticket. And if he or she sees that you don't have a record at all and decides, maybe it's just a one-time thing, I'll let you out of it. Guess what? You've been the beneficiary of this exact same type of authority that this district attorney is talking about here. Plea deals are another way of exercising that authority. It's basically saying, okay, maybe I'm not going, well, I should say some plea deals. I'm not going to get overly complicated here, but the idea is, okay, I'm not going to prosecute you for this particular offense. Lots of times defendants are charged with multiple offenses. And what the plea deal will do is they'll say, yeah, well, you plead to this one, and we'll do what's called null pros, or dismiss these other ones, all right? That's all because his discretion is given to the prosecuting attorney. And so essentially what he's saying here as the prosecutor for this county is, I am using that discretion to decide that I am not prosecuting churches for violating these particular ordinances. All right. So this gets to the question: is he taking it too far? Is he overstepping the boundaries of what his authority should be? That's an interesting question to talk about. So whether you want to talk about that or another approach, Ben, what do you think?
Well, I'm kind of two-sided on this. First of all, I think it's a good thing for churches, right, who want to gather, but again, going into that, what is safe, as long as they're practicing safe and respectful practices. The other thing, though, that is a concern for me is by singling out, was it San Luis Obispo County, is that discriminatory or unfair against other counties?
Well, that's only where his authority extends.
Okay.
In other words, he is the attorney, the state's attorney, or the district attorney for that county.
Okay.
So he can only do it in that county. Say, I'm not prosecuting in this county for these offenses.
Okay, so from like the higher ups, I don't know, does that create a tension between Governor Newsom and this district attorney?
Yeah, yeah. But it's arguable. Does this district attorney have the authority to do that? Well, when you take office, you do swear an oath to uphold the laws of the whatever jurisdiction you're in. And so I think some people will say, well, is he violating the oath of office that he gave? But then that question raises an interesting line drawing problem. Well, hold on, that oath can't mean you're going to prosecute every single thing, because then we don't have plea agreements, we don't have any of this stuff anymore. Zach has another thought.
The other question is, and I've heard a lot of discussion around this, is an order of law.
Zach is asking the question, another question he's heard an awful lot is an order a law? An executive order, in the broadly speaking, yes, it is, okay?
If it's enforceable by...
Yeah, it is enforceable. You can send a police force to enforce it, things like that. Now, there's different types of laws. There's statutory law, which is what is passed by your legislature or your city council on the local level, things like that. There's case law. If you have a decision decided by the Supreme Court, then essentially we have something called precedent, so that future judges are supposed to decide along the same way in similar cases. And then, of course, there's executive orders, which are still laws, are still enforceable. The difference being that executives change, and all laws, whether they be statutory laws, executive orders, whatever, are subject to the Constitution, and they have to. So where you see executive orders get challenged, lots of times people will say, well, this executive overstepped his authority, his or her authority, in relation to the Constitution and what that says their authority is.
Right.
So,
And we've seen those. We've talked about those on this show, taking them to the Supreme Court.
yeah.
So, so knowing that, then I don't think necessarily it's an overstep of his authority if he's taken this oath and he has that discretion within his office. Like you said, he can't prosecute every single thing, and he can't prosecute. And honestly, would it be a waste of resources? And he even mentions in this article, releasing criminals for fear of them catching COVID. And he said it would be, I forget the exact words that he used, but basically it would be wrong for them to release these criminals for fear of catching COVID and then prosecute churches for simply gathering to worship.
Yeah, okay. I'll play devil's advocate here, and I hate using that term, but maybe sometimes I am doing that. So if he were to say, I'm going to use my discretion, not prosecute anybody charged with murder, what would you think of that?
Okay, well, that's not. So there has to be an extent to discretion.
Yeah,
obviously. Yeah.
There's the issue, isn't it? Zach's throwing us for a loop. How long is your loop? Am I getting you back up here? It's a short loop. Okay.
Have you seen, there is a video that's been going around of a pastor, I'm
Zach says there's a video that's been going around about a pastor.
I do not remember where. A pastor who opened a service.
The pastor opened a service.
Welcoming people to the church and saying, "Welcome to our peaceful protest."
Oh yeah, that was John MacArthur.
That's
I'm
the
sorry,
guy
he was
we're
talking about how a pastor. He heard
Mm-hmm.
a pastor open a service. He opened it by saying, "Welcome to our peaceful protest." That was John MacArthur, who we were
Yes.
talking about last week. Yeah, who did that in California.
Yep.
You know.
So yeah, same state that we're talking about. Seems to be a lot
Is it
going
the
on in
same-
California.
Is it the same county?
I don't think it's the
I
same
don't-
county.
yeah, I don't
I don't
believe
think
so.
so. No.
Say it was like, I want to say it was Missouri,
Someone say it was what?
somewhere Midwest.
Well, no. John MacArthur did exactly that in California.
Yeah.
I want to say there was another one in the Midwest.
There may have been another
Could've
one in the
been.
Midwest somewhere. I don't know. So that I guess that's the question we have.
So where is that
Where
extent
is that
of
line
discretion?
drawn? I mean, legally, I think the term would be what's called an abuse of discretion. At what point does even discretionary figures that are given discretion, you can have something called an abuse of discretion where they take it too far. Is this an abuse of discretion? I mean, I would say arguably, I don't think it is, because, and again, I don't know what's going on in his county, but if he's got a certain amount of prosecutorial resources, certain number of police officers, certain number of prosecutors, things like that, and he's saying, look, I believe that my resources are better spent, not chasing down church services on Sunday, but doing this other thing, then I don't think you can really fault him with that. And for those people that might be of an opposite political persuasion that will disagree with me on that and say, no, it's clearly an abuse of discretion, understand every executive has done this, all right? I mean, you want to look at President Obama when he was in office and the Dreamers, okay, that there was an executive order that he decided that his, executive resources were not going to be allocated in this way, but instead they were going to be allocated in this other way. It's the same principle. That's what executives get to do, is to decide how to allocate resources. The question then becomes, when does it become abusive? And I don't think it is here, but...
No, and I don't think it is either, but I guess the case could be made that in order to, by him saying that his county is a sanctuary zone, that could be construed as
The language is somewhat inflammatory.
Yeah,
It is.
that's what I was going to say. It's kind of inflammatory to say that this is wholesale, churches can do whatever they want kind of thing. That's the...
Well, and even
inclination
using
that
that
you get
term,
from-
calling it a sanctuary county, we all know what that's referring to. You're taking a pot shot at sanctuary cities,
Yeah.
and we're going to get back to that person who criticized me a few weeks ago about saying I could never make up my mind, because I am going to be critical of that. It's like, come, just say what you don't use that kind of lingo, because
Well, let's face it, he didn't have to go out in a press conference and announce that he was going to do this. Because
Well-
no cops go out in a press conference and say, you know what, my wife just had a baby yesterday, I'm in a really good mood, so if you're only going 5 miles over the speed limit, I'm not going to give you the speeding ticket. But if you hit 15, you're done for.
You're done
I mean,
for.
they don't announce that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You're right.
So-
He didn't have to. I guess I kind of see why he would have. I mean, because there's an argument, say, he wants to set the church's mind at ease. That, hey, you guys are free. Understand, you don't have to worry about it when you're worshiping. You had one less thing to worry about when you're gathering for worship. I understand why he might have announced that, but he clearly went beyond just merely announcing his intentions to kind of take a political pot shot, if you want to call it that, which I don't care for.
I guess the argument could be made, though, by announcing that, then in effect that reduces the amount of claims or charges brought against. If he's going to just wholesale say, I'm not going to prosecute churches for worshiping, then that mitigates any kind of future discretion that's brought, or future discrepancies that are brought toward him, and thus freeing up their resources too, so they can, does that make sense?
He's got to
less
make sure
cases are going to be brought to them if he's just going to
Yeah.
get out in front of it and say we're not going to prosecute.
Yeah. But he's got to be consistent. It can't
Yeah.
just be Christian churches. If
Yeah,
anybody
yeah.
else wants to gather, he's got to let them.
That's true.
And again, just people don't think I'm being inconsistent. I will say this is a separate issue. Hey, Pastor Jay's walking by. I think we should try to get him on the show. Everybody in favor of Pastor Jay arbitrarily having to come on the show, say aye in the comment
He
section.
already passed by.
He's already gone by. He didn't even look this way. It's a big window. For those of you that are maybe watching us and you're not from Trinity, we're in the sanctuary, and the whole side over there is all windows where we can look out into the narthex. So we saw him walk all the way across the narthex and didn't even turn his head this way, probably because he knew I was going to try to get him in here. But dropped my pen. Anyway, so I forgot what I was going to say, but I'm sure it was. Oh, just not inconsistent. And there you go. See, he's walking back. He's still not even looking this way. If he watches this later, he'll know. Yes, Pastor Jay, we're talking about you, and he's gone. All right. So anyway, I do think that this is a separate issue from what churches in that county.
Okay, I have a lot of love for you both, but it is now 1:15.
I know, we got to get to our last
Yeah.
story real quick.
And
I'm wrapping
hungry.
up, I promise.
Stop commentating on Pastor Jay.
It's just it's a separate issue from what churches should do. And again, I'm not from that county. I don't know what their COVID rates are and all this kind of stuff. And so I don't comment specifically on what I think these churches in that county should do. But I do think that is a separate question. Just because the pastor is saying you can do this, you still need to make an educated decision about what is the loving thing
Needs
to
discernment.
do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, last story, shall we?
Sure thing.
I think we're already our longest episode ever,
think so.
close to it. So, all right, our last story of the day is, like we said last week, every now and then we like to throw in these surveys and everything that can be eye-opening to the church community. And this is a survey that was conducted in July by Lifeway Research that found that 27% of evangelical and mainline pastors cited maintaining unity and addressing conflict and complaints when they were asked about what are the pressures they're feeling most. So what is really hammering them most about concerning them most about being a pastor right now in this current environment. And the number one thing they said was, there's so much division in the country right now, and it's dividing our congregations, and here I am trying to keep us unified as one body of Christ. Jeanette Harrington commented on Facebook, I almost missed the show today when I thought it was starting at 5 on Wednesday this week. I'm in favor of Pastor Jay being on the show. Amen. And Jeanette, I have good news for you. First of all, it's 5:30 is when it's going to be on, not 5 o'clock, just so we know, on Wednesday, 5:30. And if you missed the very beginning of the show, I did kind of talk about that it's going to be...
Not this Wednesday, though.
Not this
Not
Wednesday,
this
though.
one,
It's
the
going to be starting next week. I just jumped the gun. We announced it was going to be starting this week, and I forgot we have something else going on Wednesday night this week, so we couldn't do it. So starting next week, we will be Wednesday at 5:30. And the good news is Ben has the nerve to take vacation.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and in September, the first 2 Wednesdays of September, he'll be out.
Right.
And so that first Wednesday, actually, Jessica McAllister I don't even know if I told you that.
Oh, no.
Jessica
Cool.
McAllister is going to be filling in.
Cool.
On, I think it's September 2nd,
Yep.
that Wednesday night. And then the following Wednesday, September 9th, I believe it is, Pastor Jay will be in that seat, and he will be filling in for Ben. So anyway, just to let you know that the Pastor Jay is actually going to be on the show. I give him a hard time, but he did agree to come back on.
Yeah.
So anyway, so here's the results of this survey that came out. It's like, really, what's really worrying you, pastors? And the number one thing cited by 27% of pastors was maintaining unity within the congregation in this culture of division. The number two thing, which was cited by 17% of pastors, was administering pastoral care from a distance when you can't actually, be in close proximity to your congregation members. And what's interesting is that it was, I'm trying to see where I saw it here. If you look at, I believe it has grown significantly, if I remember reading this right, since COVID began, as far as a previous survey that was conducted. If I remember seeing that, this whole idea about maintaining unity was not previously
It was
as much of a concern.
8% and then grew to
And now it's grew to
27%.
27%.
Yeah.
So clearly something has changed in our culture. So I guess my question then to lead this off, Ben, is, I almost called you Jess because I just said that Jess is filling in. He's not Jess. The number one question is, number one, what do you think about this survey? And number two, what do we do about it? How do we address this problem?
Yeah, number one, honestly, I'm not that surprised by it. I think it is concerning and there's a couple of factors I think that are a part of this, and they even mentioned in this survey, they say that the decision to close churches was relatively simple compared to all of the competing ideas for how to reopen churches. That's caused a lot of the division too, because people are on very opposite sides of the spectrum, and people have very strong opinions on whether we should reopen full stop or should reopen carefully and cautiously. We see that with people coming back into a certain... Now, thankfully, here at Trinity, people have been very respectful with our decisions, how we've decided to conduct their services in person. And there's just a lot of confusion as far as the uncertainty of the pandemic and that kind of looms over everybody, and then add on top of that the unrest in our society, and that there are people with varying opinions on that. So all of this is kind of like a powder keg that I'm really not surprised to see that this is a concern for at least 27% of pastors. I mean, I see that concern even working in ministry and working with people and seeing people's varying opinions. And a good pastor, you want to respond to each individual in a way that is needed. And I think another thing that correlates with this that wasn't drawn out in this, but I see it, is I'll read the quote here. One of the pastors here talks about referring to the companions of Moses described in the book of Exodus, helping him through a crisis. He says, feeling disconnected from the people and their needs, we need encouragement. Aaron and Hur to hold up my hands. It's speaking about when they held up Moses' hands in Exodus. People to come alongside me, but I am tired of virtual everything. P.S. Maybe I just need a hug. And that's honestly, it struck me, that particular quote struck me because, the social distancing, I think maybe one thing that we're not talking about often enough is the physical interaction. I think there was a study that was put out by a social therapist or someone in that field, psychological therapist, whatever that field is. I'm sorry, I totally butchered that. But the bottom line of that study, what's that? Yeah. My brain's checked out. But the bottom line of that survey was that people need 4 hugs a day for survival, 8 hugs a day for maintenance, or 12 hugs a day for growth, right? And so how many hugs a day are we, and this, I'm not trying to sound hippie-ish, but how much physical interaction are we having with people? And it's no wonder that that's having a psychological impact on people. And it's no wonder another recent study that I saw was a full 25% of young Americans between the ages of 18 to 25, I believe, have contemplated suicide within the past 6 months. Yeah. It's grown exponentially. And it's that slowly is becoming, or quickly even, is becoming its own pandemic of the ramifications of the lockdowns and this pandemic. And so I think that needs to be talked about more. And I know I'm kind of getting off topic of what this original article was about, but I do see a correlation there in terms of helping people and doing so from a distance. That was the number 2 concern for pastors. But again, it's this disunity because we're all disconnected physically, and so it leads to volatile emotional disconnect. And so your second question, getting roundabout to that, right. What do we do about it? I think we need to understand people first. We need to understand where people are coming from. We need to do so in love, always not be in our interactions, understanding people are going to have strong opinions, and not to, if people come at us with those strong opinions, to do the loving thing and be loving and kind in our responses. And but also to use discernment to do what's going to be best for the most loving thing for our congregation, which I feel like at Trinity we've kind of done, and we've done a good job trying to figure out how we can still distance and keep people safe, and that's the loving response. But also I think more attention maybe needs to be placed, not even just here, but in the church in general, on individuals' needs and getting at what's behind those strong opinions and why people are lashing out at that, getting at the heart of why people are feeling the way that they are and speaking to them the love of Christ.
Yeah, and maybe what you said there at the end, the love of Christ. Well, we got Zach Kreiner, who is no longer in the building and is now commenting on YouTube, says humans were designed for physical and social interaction. Yeah, you're right, and that's why I'm not surprised at all to see things like those studies are showing, is that without the physical intimacy, then you do lose something. And there's somebody else commented here on YouTube, somebody named Katie Lander. I think you might have heard of her. Katie, I was going to say the same thing. There aren't enough Reese hugs to go around right now. Reese Turner, for those of you that are not watching her and are from Trinity, she's on staff here. She did co-host the show a few weeks back when Ben... You take time off all the... No, I'm kidding.
We had a baby or something.
He had a baby, so... but yeah, she is very much... She's a hugger, and she's, I think, going insane right now with the fact that she can't do that. Absolutely.
But it's more than just hugs. the Bible talks about us laying hands on each other for healing
Yeah.
purposes, and just the simple putting a hand on a shoulder to reassure somebody that I'm here for you, to help you, holding their hands when you pray with them. It's all like we're not supposed to do it, and we're all missing it.
Well, and I guess I kind of want to bring this back around specifically to the pastors and their struggle. Maybe it would have been great if we could have gotten Pastor Jay to come on here to talk about this, because obviously he understands this far more than even we do. Because I know he feels this.
Yeah.
Every pastor is going to feel this struggle. And you mentioned something about the love of Christ there at the end, and I think maybe that's part of the tension that we feel, is that we should be able to unite around the main thing. And the main thing is Jesus Christ and him crucified. He's crucified, he died for our sins, he rose from the dead, and we should be able to gather around that, much like a healthy family that loves each other should be able to talk about controversial issues and that they have differences of opinion on, and yet still come out at the end loving each other. If a Christian family can keep the main thing, then we should be able to talk about these issues and yet still come out as a unified body. We're seeing some cracks in that armor, I think, right now in the Christian community. And I think the struggle that, a lot of the tension that I think a lot of pastors may be feeling is, yes, you want to keep the main thing. And so you figure, well, if I just focus on this, then that's going to help keep the community unified. In other words, if all we talk about are the things that unify us, then we don't have to worry about this division. But also, if all you talk about are the things that unify us, then all you're talking about is the things that unify us. Sure. And and I'll just use an example of abortion, all right? Because on the show, I'm avidly pro-life. I've talked about it very much on the show before. And so you ask me, it's like, okay, are there people in various Christian congregations around the country, probably even here at Trinity, that are going to disagree with me on that? Yeah, I guarantee you there are. Sure. All right. So if we want to avoid any risk of disunity, especially in a time like this, so we just talk about Jesus, the strict gospel message, and we keep it at that, and then we don't talk about issues like abortion. Is that really the answer either? And I think, and I would say no, it's not. It's clearly not. You still have this thing that Jesus did want us. There's this idea of justice, and we do need to still talk about what's right. And there are differences of opinion about this concept of justice and what's right. Not just talking about COVID, we're talking about the racial issues and everything like that that's permeating our culture right now.
Everything that's leading up to all of this.
And so I guess my encouragement is, it is a pastor's job, and I hope people may disagree with me on this, but I'm going to try to encourage every Christian out there watching. In my mind, it absolutely is a pastor's job to teach, to preach, to talk about that from a biblical perspective, to talk about those hard issues, to talk about the racial issues we're talking about in our culture today, to talk about the COVID-19 issues and how to be loving versus properly worshiping God and all that. They should be talking about those things. You may disagree with your pastor about those things. I would hope you would listen to them because, again, most pastors been to seminary, probably have know a little more than you do. But then again, I disagree with pastors too. Sure. I disagreed with John MacArthur last week. So, but in the end, if you disagree with your pastor on some of these issues, and I'm not just speaking here to Trinity, please don't misunderstand me, I'm talking worldwide. If you disagree with your pastor on some of these issues, I hope that Christians won't use that as an excuse to bolt and leave a church and go to another church. If there's other deeper theological issues, that's different, obviously. But on stuff like this, we should be able to, just like a family that loves each other, we should be able to stay together through it.
And picking up on a beat that you had hit last episode was, what does that say to the unchurched people? What does that say to the non-Christian community? If we can't agree or we can't come out of our disagreements lovingly, then what does that say to people who may have been looking at joining a church, right? Well, they are fighting amongst themselves. And again, this is not really a new problem, but it's just taken on new light with new issues. But if we can't disagree but still love one another, then why would anybody want to be a Christian?
How many people in the culture today equate Christianity with those what we call surface issues?
Yep.
You know, they think that the identity of the church is its stance on abortion, is its stance on this, that, or the other. You know, you want to talk about what separates this church from this church. It's, you know, well, this church is the church that believes that abortion is okay, or this is the church that believes that abortion is not okay. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Since when did our identity become those surface issues? Now, I'm not saying not to diminish them, not to say they're not important.
Sure.
But the surface identity is supposed to be in Christ.
Absolutely.
And if we're not communicating that, then you're right. The question is, what does it communicate to the surrounding world? They're not going to see the gospel message if all they see are disagreement about the surface issues and people splitting up and dividing over that.
Right.
So, again, deep theological issues are not what I classify as superficial issues. I want to be clear about that. You know, but yeah, things like keep the gospel the main thing, and help that unify us so that we can be free to talk about these very important issues, but still be unified in the end. All right. Now we are officially the longest episode ever of Trinity Talk Live. My wife's sitting there like this. They gonna be done yet? So I think we're done now. We've talked these issues to death. And so I appreciate it. Hey, for all of you that joined us, if anybody out there was watching at the beginning of the show and is still watching here at the end of the show, God bless you. So, I mean, even Zach didn't stay in the room, although he's apparently watching online now.
Yeah.
But even he said, no, I need to go get lunch. So speaking of which, that's what we need to do too. So just a quick reminder at the very end of the show here, next week we will, I promise, this time it's really going to happen, we will be moving to Wednesday at 5:30. So make sure you mark your calendars. Next week we will be on Wednesday evening at 5:30. Tune in then. Hopefully that'll allow more people to be able to watch us and not have, work schedules and everything get in the way, and, West Coasters or whatever. Or as of today, we had somebody from Israel watching us. That was very cool. Raphael, if you're still watching, thank you very much for watching. Hope you come back again next week. Other than that, that's all I got. What is the date today? Today is the 17th. So you're still here next week.
Yeah.
But then it's the following week is your
Correct.
first week off.
Yeah.
So we got Ben for one more week. So thank you for doing our marathon episode today.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
appreciate it.
Thanks, Ken. Some good discussion.
And thank you to Mary Kay and to Sarah for running everything behind the scenes. And thank you to Zach for his contributions today. And thank you to all of you for your contribution, whether you contributed today and commented online or whether you didn't. We really appreciate the interaction, and we appreciate you watching us and deeming us worthy of your time. So with that being said, God bless everyone. See you next week.